The late afternoon sun was a white, heavy thing, pressing down on the asphalt of the county road and baking the air inside the patrol car. Dan, the officer behind the wheel, felt the sweat stick his uniform to the vinyl seat. He'd only been with the county sheriff's department for a few months, fresh out of the academy and buzzing with a nervous energy he mistook for readiness. Today, that energy had curdled into a sour, persistent mood. Every shift felt like a test he was scared to fail. The morning had been a string of small defeats. A call about a noisy neighbor had turned into a shouting match he couldn't calm. An old man, lost and confused, had looked at his uniform with pure fear, not relief. Each interaction left him feeling smaller, less in control. He wanted order. He wanted respect. He thought they were the same thing. He was parked near the old oak tree at the junction of Route 7 and Millbank, a spot his training officer had said was good for catching speeders. But his mind wasn't on speed. It was replaying the sneer of the noisy neighbor, the trembling fear of the old man. He felt invisible in the wrong way, a boy playing dress-up in a man's uniform. He needed something to go right. He needed to prove, mostly to himself, that he was in charge out here. That's when the car passed him. It wasn't speeding, not really, but it was smooth. A late-model sedan, dark and clean, its windows a shade too dark, tinted like a pair of expensive sunglasses. It glided past his cruiser with a quiet hum that felt, to Dan's prickling skin, like a challenge. It looked expensive. It looked out of place on this dusty stretch of road. And those window tints were definitely past the legal limit. A jolt, almost of relief, went through him. Here was something clear. A violation. Something he could measure and correct. No argument, no messy emotions. Just a rule and a consequence. He flicked on the lights, the red and blue splashing color against the dry grass, and pulled out behind the sedan. It signaled politely and eased onto the wide gravel shoulder. Dan took a breath, adjusting his hat in the rear view, putting on what he hoped was a stern, capable face. He approached the driver's side, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. The window slid down silently. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of vanilla. The driver was a woman. She looked to be in her 40s, maybe early 50s, but carried herself with an ageless sort of calm. Her hair was styled in neat, dark twists. She wore a simple but sharp-looking white blouse. And over the curve of the steering wheel, Dan could see a skirt of beautiful, summery fabric in a deep floral print, falling just below her knees. She looked like she was on her way to a nice lunch, or maybe coming from church. She turned to look at him, her eyes hidden behind a pair of stylish sunglasses. "Afternoon, ma'am," Dan said, his voice coming out a little tighter than he intended. "License and registration, please." "Of course, officer," she said. Her voice was low, even, polite. Not friendly, but not unfriendly. She moved smoothly, pulling the documents from the glove compartment and handing them over. Her fingers didn't fumble. Her hands were steady. Dan took them back to his cruiser. The sun beat on the hood. He ran her information. Eleanor Royce. The name meant nothing to him. The registration was current. The address was in one of the nicer new developments near the town limits. No warrants. Not even a parking ticket. Her record was cleaner than his own. A normal officer, a calm officer, would have walked back, handed her the documents, given her a warning about the window tint, and sent her on her way. But Dan felt that old frustration bubbling up. This was supposed to be his moment of control. This clean record, this calm demeanor, it felt like she was winning somehow. She was sitting in her cool, expensive car, unbothered, while he stood sweating in the sun. The hunch, that ugly, whispering feeling, started in his gut. He walked back to her car. He handed her the license and registration. "Everything seems in order, Miss Royce," he said. Then he paused, letting the silence hang. "But I need you to step out of the vehicle for me, please." A slight, almost imperceptible shift in her posture. She didn't recoil. She just turned her head a fraction more toward him. The sunglasses made her impossible to read. "May I ask why, officer?" "I smelled marijuana," Dan said. The lie came out easily, propelled by his need to take charge of the situation. He'd heard other guys use it, a catch-all phrase to justify a deeper look. For the first time, he saw a crack in her calm. Not fear, but a flash of something harder. Disbelief. "You smelled marijuana," she repeated, her tone flat. "Yes, ma'am." "Please step out." She let out a slow breath, then nodded. She turned off the engine, removed her sunglasses, placing them neatly on the dashboard. Her eyes, now visible, were sharp and intelligent. She opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel. She was taller than he'd expected, and she stood very straight, smoothing her skirt with one hand. She looked at him, waiting. Dan felt a new kind of unease. She wasn't acting like people usually did. There was no nervous chatter, no angry outburst. She was just watching him. It was disconcerting. He had the script, the nervous citizen, the angry citizen, but she was giving him nothing to work with. Her silence felt heavy, accusatory. "Stand over here, please," he said, pointing to a spot near the rear of her car. She walked there, her low heels making soft impressions in the gravel. The sun caught the rich colors of her skirt. It was a lovely piece of clothing, clearly well made. "Arms out to the sides, please," Dan instructed, beginning a pat-down. He was professional, thorough, keeping to the standard procedure. He felt nothing. No bulges, no packages, no hidden contraband. Just the light starch of her blouse and the fine fabric of her skirt. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzz of locusts in the field nearby. As he finished, his eyes kept drifting back to the skirt. The hunch was screaming now, a loud, irrational voice in his head. Asterisk, it's in the lining. They hide stuff in the hem. She's too calm. She's hiding something. Asterisk, it was a theory built on suspicion and bad TV. But in that moment, it felt like a detective's insight. He needed to act. He needed to show he wasn't just going through the motions. He pulled out his department-issued knife from his utility belt. It was a solid, tactical folding knife. Her eyes locked onto the blade. The calm finally shattered, replaced by a look of pure, stunned incredulity. "What are you doing?" "I need to check the hem of your skirt," Dan said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too loud in the quiet afternoon. "I have reason to believe you may be concealing something." "That is a designer garment," she said, her voice rising for the first time, edged with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "You have no reason. It'll just be a second," he said, cutting her off. And before she could say another word, before he could listen to the sudden alarm bell ringing in the back of his own mind, he bent down. He took the delicate floral fabric of the skirt between his finger and thumb, pinning it against her calf. He could feel the warmth of her skin through the material. With his other hand, he opened the blade and, in one rough upward motion, he sliced. The sound was awful. A loud, tearing rip that seemed to swallow the sounds of the field. The blade was sharp, meant for cutting seatbelts in rope. It went through the silk-lined fabric like it was tissue paper, parting it from just above her knee all the way down to the ankle. A long, jagged flap of beautiful cloth fell away, exposing her leg. The skirt was ruined, hanging off her in a grotesque, lopsided way. Dan stood up, blinking. He looked at the torn fabric, then at the woman. The world seemed to hold its breath. Her face had gone through a transformation. The disbelief had burned away, leaving something cold and hard as stone. She looked from the ruined skirt to the knife in his hand to his face. Her eyes took in his name tag, his badge number, the number on the side of his patrol car. She memorized it all with a terrifying, focused intensity. When she spoke, her voice was quiet again, but it carried a chill that made the hot air feel freezing. It was low, precise, and absolute. "You will regret that, officer." She didn't yell it. She stated it. A simple fact, delivered with the certainty of gravity. Then she turned, the torn skirt whispering against itself, and walked back to her car. She didn't look at him again. She got in, started the engine, and pulled slowly back onto the road. The ruined hem of her skirt, visible through the window. Dan stood on the shoulder. The knife still in his hand, the piece of floral fabric a tiny, accusing spot of color in the dust by his boots. The victory he'd wanted felt like ashes in his mouth. A deep, sick feeling settled in his stomach. He told himself she was just angry, just blowing off steam. But the way she had looked at him, and the quiet, absolute certainty in her voice. He folded the knife, shoved it back in its pouch, and walked back to his cruiser on unsteady legs. He got in, the vinyl seat scorching hot. He tried to write it off. Asterisk a difficult subject. Possibly hiding contraband. Took necessary steps. Asterisk he drove away from the old oak tree, trying to outrun the creeping dread that had already begun to coil, cold and tight, around his spine. The test, he was starting to realize, was not over. It had only just begun, and he had already failed in ways he couldn't yet understand. The air inside the patrol car felt thicker now, harder to breathe. Dan drove away from the spot under the old oak tree, the image of the torn skirt flashing behind his eyes every time he blinked. His hands were tight on the steering wheel, knuckles pale. He tried to shake it off, to fall back on the story he was already building in his head. Asterisk she was hiding something. She had to be. That call was an act. The tint was illegal. I had a right to check. Asterisk, but the memory of the sound, that loud, ripping tear, wouldn't leave him. It was a sound that didn't belong in a routine traffic stop. It was a violent sound. And her face, in that last second, not scared, not even really angry. It was something else. It was a kind of freezing cold certainty that had left a chill in the pit of his stomach. He drove for 20 minutes without seeing another car. The quiet of the country roads, usually peaceful, felt heavy and watchful. He found himself glancing in the rearview mirror too often, half expecting to see that dark sedan following him. Of course, it wasn't there. He needed to talk to someone, to hear a voice tell him he'd done the right thing, that it was just part of the job. He pulled into the parking lot of a small, run-down convenience store at a crossroads. He went in, the bell jangling, and bought a bottle of soda. The clerk, an older man with tired eyes, barely looked at him. "Hot one," Dan said. "Just to say something." "Yep," the clerk said, taking his money. Back in the cruiser, Dan took a long drink. The sugar and caffeine did nothing. He picked up the radio microphone, his thumb hovering over the button. He could call it in. A brief report. Asterisk conducted a search on a non-compliant subject. Negative result. Asterisk, but something stopped him. A nervous, squirmy feeling. If he called it in, it would be on record. The sergeant might ask questions. Why did he cut the skirt? What was his probable cause beyond a hunch? The lie about smelling marijuana felt thin and stupid now. Out here in the silent car, he put the microphone back. He'd write it up later at the station. He could choose his words more carefully on paper. For the rest of his shift, he was jumpy. A dog running across a yard made him flinch. The wail of a distant train whistle sounded like a siren. He did his job, but his heart wasn't in it. He was just going through the motions, waiting for the clock to run out. The confidence he'd been trying to wear all day was gone, replaced by a hollow, echoing feeling. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, the dark sedan moved steadily away from the county road, towards the nicer part of the township. Inside, the woman's hands were perfectly steady on the wheel, but her jaw was set so tight it ached. The air conditioning blew on her legs, and she could feel the strange uneven draft where the fabric was gone. The physical feeling of it, the violation of it, was a hot brand on her skin. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. A white-hot fury was building inside her, but it was a cold fire, one that burned clear and focused. She had grown up in this county. She had faced looks and whispers and assumptions her whole life. The assumption that she didn't belong in certain spaces, that her success was a fluke, that her calmness was weakness. She had learned to navigate it, to rise above it with grace and an unwavering dignity that disarmed most people. But this was different. This wasn't a look or a whisper. This was an action, a deliberate, physical act of disrespect and destruction from a man whose salary her taxes helped pay. She thought of her husband. He was a big man, with a loud laugh and a famously short temper when it came to injustice. But he was also fair, sometimes brutally so. He believed in the law, in the system he served. She knew what would happen if she called him right now, sobbing. He would roar. He would probably jump in his own car and hunt that young officer down. And while a part of her wanted to see that boy's face go pale with a real fear, she knew it wasn't the way. This couldn't be handled with yelling. This had to be handled with the full, heavy weight of the system her husband represented. This officer needed to learn a lesson, and the lesson couldn't just be a slap on the wrist from an angry husband. It had to be something that would stick, that would maybe, just maybe, change how he saw the next person he pulled over. She drove straight home, to their comfortable house on a quiet street. She parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, gathering herself. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over what was left of her skirt. Then she got out, walked inside, and went directly to their bedroom. She did not change immediately. Instead, she stood in front of the full-length mirror. She looked at herself. The beautiful skirt, a gift from her sister, was destroyed. It hung, a ragged flag of indignity. She let herself feel it, the humiliation, the shock, the anger. She let it wash over her. Then she took another breath and let it settle. She would not carry this feeling. She would give it back. She carefully took off the ruined outfit. She folded the torn skirt neatly, almost tenderly, and placed it on the bed. It was evidence now. She changed into a pair of simple, elegant pants and a fresh blouse. She looked at the clock. Her husband would be finishing up at the office soon. She picked up her phone. Her finger hovered over his direct line. Then she put it down. This wasn't a phone call. This needed to be face-to-face. Asterisk, 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 back at the county sheriff's office. The shift was changing. The day crew was tired, looking forward to getting home. The evening crew was just clocking in, the air filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the rustle of paperwork. Dan pushed through the heavy glass doors into the bullpen. The familiar noise and fluorescent light usually felt like a relief after a day on the road. Today, it felt like an interrogation. He avoided eye contact, heading straight for his assigned desk, a small, cluttered space near the back. He wanted to be invisible. He sat down and pulled out his logbook. He stared at the blank page. He started writing, his handwriting messier than usual. Asterisk time, 1547. Location, Route 7 at Millbank. Vehicle, dark sedan. Violation, excessive window tint. Driver exhibited nervous behavior. Upon search of vehicle and subject, no contraband located. Issued verbal warning for tint. Asterisk. He read it over. It was dry. It was clean. It left out the knife, the tearing sound, the look on her face. It was a lie of omission, and it sat on the page like a stain. He felt a prickle of sweat on his neck. He was about to close the book when a large shadow fell across his desk. It was Sergeant Miller, a veteran with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen everything twice. Strickland. How'd it go out there? Dan's heart gave a hard thump. Fine, Sarge. Quiet. Anything to report? Miller asked, his tone casual. He was just making conversation. The lie came automatically. Not really. Just a traffic stop. Lady with dark windows. Let her off with a warning. Miller nodded, about to move on. Dan felt a wave of relief. It was going to be okay. He'd gotten away with it. He'd just be more careful next time. No more hunches. No more knives. Just then, the main doors to the bullpen swung open with a force that made the glass panels shudder. Every head in the room turned. Sheriff Royce stood in the doorway. He was not a man you could miss. He was broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to take up all the space in a room. His face, usually capable of a wide, welcoming grin, was set in a hard, flat line. His eyes, sharp and missing nothing, scanned the room. And beside him, walking with a calm, deliberate pace, was the woman. She had changed her clothes, but her expression was the same one she'd worn by the side of the road, that icy, focused calm. She looked across the sea of uniforms, her gaze moving from one face to another, searching. Dan's blood turned to ice in his veins. He felt his stomach drop away. He wanted to slide under his desk. He wanted to disappear. The low murmur of the bullpen died instantly. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the distant crackle of a radio. All the air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Sheriff Royce's eyes completed their sweep. They passed over Dan once, then snapped back and locked onto him. There was no recognition of a young rookie, just a cold, hard focus. His voice, when he spoke, was not a yell. It was a low, controlled rumble that carried to every corner of the silent room. Officer Strickland. He didn't need to say anything else. The two words were a verdict. Dan felt every pair of eyes in the room swing to him. The heat of their stares was like a physical pressure. "My office," the sheriff said. Now, he didn't wait for a reply. He turned, his arm going gently, almost protectively, around his wife's shoulders. He guided her towards the large corner office with his name on the door. Dan stood up. His legs felt like they were made of wood. The walk across the bullpen felt like the longest walk of his life. The floor seemed to tilt under his feet. He could feel the stares of the other deputies, curiosity, pity, confusion. He kept his eyes straight ahead, on the sheriff's back, on the woman's steady stride. The door to the office loomed like the entrance to a cave. As he reached it, the sheriff held the door open for his wife, then turned to look at Dan one last time before he entered. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was a deep, profound disappointment. It was worse than any shout. Dan stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the quiet room, separating him from the world outside. He was alone now with the sheriff and his wife. The uniform he wore, which had felt like a costume all day, now felt like it was weighing him down, pulling him straight through the floor. He was standing in the center of the room, but he had never felt SM. The air in the sheriff's office was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the stuffy bullpen. But to Dan, it felt like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy and charged, ready to crack open. The door clicking shut behind him was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He stood just inside the room, unable to move further, his hands stiff at his sides. The office was big, but it felt terribly small. On one wall were framed photos of the sheriff with various community groups. On another, his degrees and certificates. A large wooden desk sat in the middle, neat and orderly. Behind it was a big leather chair. Sheriff Royce did not sit in it. He stood beside his wife, who had taken a seat in one of the chairs facing the desk. She sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Dan with an unnerving calm. The sheriff looked at Dan, his gaze like 2 points of physical pressure. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence build, let Dan stand there in the middle of the room, feeling every second of it. Dan's mouth was dry. He could hear the slow, heavy tick of a clock on the wall. "Officer," the sheriff said finally. His voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. "Do you recognize this citizen?" Dan's eyes flicked to the woman. Her face was composed, but her eyes held a world of quiet fury. He had to force his throat to work. "Yes, sir. From where?" the sheriff asked, taking a single step forward. "From a traffic stop this afternoon, sir." "On Route 7. The sheriff nodded slowly. "A traffic stop. For what violation?" "Excessive window tint, sir," Dan said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "And was a citation issued?" "A warning, sir. A civil warning." Another long pause. The sheriff looked at his wife, then back at Dan. A warning? So it was a minor stop. A routine matter. "Yes, sir." The sheriff's expression didn't change. "Then perhaps you can explain to me, officer, why my wife arrived home today in a state of profound distress. Why a skirt she was particularly fond of, a gift from her sister, had been cut from her body with a knife." Dan felt a hot flush crawl up his neck. "Sir, I had probable cause to believe she was concealing contraband. I smelled marijuana." The woman, Eleanor Royce, let out a soft sound. It wasn't a laugh. It was a dismissive exhale of pure disbelief. The sheriff's eyes never left Dan's face. "You smelled marijuana," he repeated, his tone flat, dead. "Yes, sir." "Did you find any marijuana, officer?" "No, sir." "Did you find anything at all? Any contraband? Any weapon? Anything that was against the law?" "No, sir." The sheriff took another step, coming around the side of his desk. He moved with a controlled power that made Dan want to step back. He stopped a few feet away. "So, based on a smell that left no evidence, on a feeling, you made the decision to destroy a woman's personal property. To use a blade on her clothing while she was wearing it. It was part of a lawful search, sir," Dan said, but his voice was weak. The words sounded hollow, even to him. "Lawful?" The sheriff's quiet tone finally broke, rising just a notch. "Show me the law, son. Show me the procedure in the manual that says you get to take a knife to a person's clothing because you have a hunch. Is it in the search and seizure guidelines? Is it in the use of force continuum?" Dan had no answer. He stared at a point on the carpet. "Look at her," the sheriff commanded. His voice hard dot, Dan forced his eyes up to meet Eleanor Royce's. Up close. He could see the fine lines of anger around her mouth, the deep hurt in her eyes. It was a different kind of look than he had ever received. It wasn't fear of his authority. It was a judgment of his character. "Now," the sheriff said, his voice dropping back to that dangerous quiet, "you are going to listen. You are not going to speak. You are going to hear, from the citizen you detained, exactly what happened. And you are going to understand what you did." He gave a slight nod to his wife. Eleanor Royce took a breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and level, but every word was precise, chosen with care. She did not sound hysterical. She sounded like a witness giving the most important testimony of her life. "I was driving home from having lunch with a friend," she began, her eyes never leaving Dan's. "I saw your cruiser under the tree. I knew my window tint might be a shade too dark. It was an oversight. When you pulled me over, I intended to be polite and cooperative. I gave you my license and registration without delay." She leaned forward slightly. "You came back and told me everything was in order. Then you asked me to step out of the car. I asked you why. You told me you smelled marijuana. I was shocked. I do not smoke. I have never smoked. There has never been marijuana in my car." The claim was, it was an obvious lie. I could see it in your face. You were nervous. You were looking for a reason. Dan wanted to look away, but he was pinned by her gaze. "I got out of the car," she continued. "You had me stand by the rear. You patted me down. You were thorough. You found nothing. I could see you getting more frustrated. You felt you had to find something to justify the lie you had already told. Then you looked at my skirt. I saw your eyes change. I saw you decide." She paused, and for the first time her voice wavered, just a little, with the memory of the violation. "You took out your knife. I asked you what you were doing. You told me you needed to check the hem. I told you it was a designer garment, that you had no reason. You did not listen. You bent down. You took the fabric, and you cut it. You ripped it open. I felt the blade pass, so close to my skin. I felt the air on my leg where the fabric had been. I looked down and saw my skirt ruined, hanging off me. A tear, single and fierce, escaped her eye. She did not wipe it away. I have never felt so humiliated in my life. Not by a stranger. Not by someone who was supposed to serve and protect. You looked at me, and you saw a suspect. You saw a problem to be solved. You did not see a person. You did not see a taxpayer. You did not see a human being who deserved basic dignity." She sat back, the tear tracing a path down her cheek. "And then you let me go, with a warning for the tint. As if destroying my property, my sense of safety, was nothing. As if it was just part of your day." The room was silent again. The truth of her words filled the space, leaving no room for Dan's excuses. The sheriff was looking at him, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. His wife had said everything he needed to say. "Officer Strickland," the sheriff said, "you have heard the account. Is there anything she said that was incorrect? Any detail you would like to dispute?" Dan tried to find a word, any word. He wanted to say she was exaggerating. He wanted to say he was just doing his job. But under the weight of that quiet, factual telling, his own story, the one he had written in his logbook, crumbled to dust. He shook his head slowly. "No, sir," he whispered. The sheriff walked back behind his desk. He sat down in his big chair, the leather sighing under his weight. He steepled his fingers, looking at Dan over the top of them. "All right then," he said. "Here is what is going to happen. As of this moment, you are suspended. Without pay. You will turn in your badge, your gun, and your department ID. You will leave this building, and you will not return until you are instructed to do so by a formal review board." Each word landed like a hammer blow. Suspended, without pay. Dan felt dizzy. "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, his voice like iron, "you will be personally responsible for the full and fair replacement cost of my wife's clothing. You will receive a bill. You will pay it. Consider it a small lesson in consequences." He leaned forward. "But the bigger lesson, officer, is this. You did not just cut a piece of cloth. You cut away the trust that this community places in every one of us who wears this badge. You acted on prejudice, not procedure. You acted on ego, not evidence. You wanted to feel in control, so you took control away from a citizen who had done nothing wrong. That is an abuse of power. It is the exact opposite of why we are here." He stood up again, his presence filling the room. You are dismissed. Sergeant Miller will escort you out. The review board will contact you with the date of your hearing. That hearing will determine if you ever wear a badge in this county again." He looked at his wife. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The conversation was over. Dan stood there numb. He fumbled with his badge, the metal cold in his sweating fingers. He unclipped his holster, the weight of the gun feeling suddenly alien and wrong. He placed them both on the corner of the sheriff's desk. They looked small and insignificant. Without another word, he turned. His legs carried him to the door. He opened it and stepped back into the bullpen. Every deputy in the room was pretending not to watch, but he could feel their eyes. Sergeant Miller was waiting for him, his face unreadable. "Let's go." "Son," Miller said softly. Dan followed him. A ghost in a uniform that was no longer his. Walking out of the building and into the blinding light of the late afternoon sun. The world outside looked the same, but everything had changed. The weight of what he had done, the reality of it, finally settled on him with a crushing finality. He had not just lost a job. He had lost his way. And the long, hard road back, if there even was one, was only just beginning in the shadow of that torn skirt and the quiet, terrible truth that had been spoken in that room. The next few days passed in a fog for Dan. It was a strange, hollow kind of time. The suspension wasn't a vacation. It was a punishment. He woke up at the usual hour, his body trained for the shift, and then he had nothing to do. The silence in his small apartment was oppressive. He avoided the news. He didn't answer calls from a couple of guys on the force, not out of anger, but out of a deep, burning shame. What could he say to them? The envelope from the sheriff's department arrived on the third day. It wasn't thick. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a bill, itemized and formal, for the replacement of the skirt and blouse. The numbers were printed in clean black ink. They were not outrageous, but they were substantial. More than a week's take-home pay for him. The note at the bottom said payment due in 30 days. It was signed by a department administrator. It felt colder than a fine. It was a direct, personal debt. A constant reminder. He stared at the number. He thought about the woman Eleanor Royce carefully. Choosing those clothes, putting on that outfit for her day. He thought about the clean, tearing sound. He folded the bill and put it in a drawer, but he couldn't hide from it. A week later, a second envelope came. This one was official. It contained the notice for his disciplinary review hearing. Date, time, location. A list of possible outcomes. Reinstatement, further suspension, demotion, termination. The word termination seemed to pulse on the page. It also listed his rights, including the right to have a representative from the police union present. Dan called the union rep, an older officer named Grady, who had seen it all. Grady's voice on the phone was weary, not unkind, but blunt. "Kid, you stepped in it. Royce is furious, and he's not the type to make a show. He's by the book, and the book says what you did was way over the line. What do I do?" Dan asked, his voice sounding young and lost even to himself. "You show up," Grady said with a sigh. "You listen. You answer their questions honestly. Don't try to be a hero. Don't make excuses. And hope that Royce's sense of fairness outweighs his desire to make an example of you. He's tough, but he's not cruel. He believes in fixing problems, not just throwing people away. That might be your only shot." Asterisk, 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 the day of the hearing arrived. Dan put on his only suit, a dark, cheap thing he'd bought for his academy graduation. It felt tight and wrong. He drove to the county administration building, not the sheriff's office. This was a civil process, separate from the bullpen. It made it feel more serious, more final. The hearing room was plain. a long table at the front for the review board, a few chairs scattered for observers. At the front table sat 3 people, a retired judge, a community leader from the local business association, and a senior captain from a neighboring county sheriff's department. They looked solemn, professional. Sheriff Royce was also there, sitting off to the side at a smaller table. He did not look at Dan when he walked in. Eleanor Royce was there too. She sat in the first row of the observer chairs, dressed in a simple, powerful navy blue dress. She looked composed. She looked like truth waiting to be heard. Dan sat at a small table alone. The union rep Grady came in and sat next to him, giving him a brief, grim nod. The retired judge, who was chairing, explained the process. This was an internal fact-finding and disciplinary review. They would hear a statement from the sheriff, a statement from the involved citizen, and then would question Dan. Sheriff Royce went first. He stood, not at the podium, but near his seat. He spoke without notes. He described Dan's employment record short, unremarkable. He outlined the official policy on searches, on use of force, on officer discretion, and probable cause. He was calm, factual, like a professor giving a lecture. Then he got to the day in question. The officer's stated probable cause was the odor of marijuana, the sheriff said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. No marijuana was found. No other contraband was found. The search yielded nothing but a deeply distressed citizen and a destroyed piece of personal property. The action taken using a blade to cut the clothing from a compliant individual finds no basis in our department policy, in state law, or in common sense. It was an act of improvisation, born of frustration and poor judgment. It violated the public trust and inflicted unnecessary humiliation. He paused, looking at the board. My recommendation is for termination. This was a fundamental breach of conduct. However, he said, and this time he did look at Dan, a brief, piercing glance. The board's decision is your own. I will abide by it. He sat down. The word termination hung in the air. Then Eleanor Royce was asked to speak. She walked to the front. She didn't stand behind the podium. She just stood before the board, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She told her story again. It was the same story she had told in the office, but here, in this formal setting, it was even more devastating. She spoke not with anger, but with a painful clarity. She described the feeling of the blade, the shock of the torn fabric, the long, silent drive home. She talked about the fear that now colored her thoughts when she saw a patrol car, fear she had never felt before in her own community. I am not here to destroy a young man's career, she said, her voice clear. I am here because what happened cannot be ignored. It was wrong. If it is ignored, it tells him it was okay. It tells every other officer it might be okay. And it tells every citizen like me that we are not safe from the very people supposed to protect us. He needs to learn. The department needs to learn. I want the lesson to be one that lasts. When she finished, she returned to her seat. The room was utterly silent. Her words had stripped away any last remaining argument Anne might have had in his mind. She wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for responsibility. Then it was Dan's turn. The board members asked him questions. They weren't yelling. They were curious, probing. Why did you really ask her to step out of the car? The community leader asked. Dan swallowed. She was very calm. It made me suspicious. I thought she was hiding something. Is calmness a sign of guilt? In your training? A captain from the other county asked, his eyebrow raised. No, sir. The knife, the retired judge said, leaning forward. Walk us through your thought process. At what point did using a blade on a citizen's clothing seem like the appropriate next step? Dan looked down at his hands. There was no good answer. I don't know, sir. I thought I might find something. I felt like I had to finish the search. Had to, or wanted to. The judge asked softly. Dan didn't answer. He couldn't. They asked him more, about his training, about his interactions with the public before that day. He answered honestly, his voice low. He admitted he'd been frustrated. He admitted he'd had a bad day and took it out on the stop. He admitted the odor of marijuana was a pretext. He used the word himself, a pretext. Hearing himself say it out loud in that room was like admitting to a crime. Finally, the questions stopped. The board asked him if he had anything to add. He looked up, his eyes blurry. He looked first at the board, then at Sheriff Royce, and finally, for a second, at Eleanor Royce. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were small in the big room. "It was wrong. What I did was wrong. I am sorry to you, ma'am, for the humiliation. And I am sorry to the department for failing what it stands for." It wasn't a speech. It was just 3 simple sentences. But they were the first completely honest things he had said about the whole mess. The board thanked him. They said they would deliberate, and their written decision would be sent to him and to the sheriff within 5 business days. The hearing was over. Dan walked out of the building, the bright sun feeling like an accusation. Grady clapped him on the shoulder once, a wordless gesture that meant asterisk, you did okay. Kid asterisk, but it felt empty. The wait was worse than the hearing. Every ring of his phone made him jump. He checked the mail the moment the postman came. On the 4th day, the letter came. His hands shook as he opened it. He skimmed the formal language, his heart pounding, looking for the verdict. The words jumped out at him. Asterisk, asterisk. Determined that termination, while justified, is not the most constructive path forward in this instance. Asterisk, asterisk. He wasn't fired. He read on, his breath catching. He was demoted. Upon any reinstatement, he would lose his rank as a patrol officer and be reassigned to desk duty for a period of no less than 6 months. He would also be required to complete a detailed program of remedial training, the specifics of which would be determined by the sheriff. And then he read the last condition, the one that made his stomach twist with a new kind of dread. Asterisk, asterisk. Furthermore, the officer will complete a series of supervised community immersion and observational ride-alongs, to be documented and reflected upon, with the goal of rebuilding perspective on the role of law enforcement in the community it serves. Asterisk, asterisk. He wasn't just getting a slap on the wrist. He was being sent back to school, a school of shame. He would have to face the department, the people he'd let down, every day from behind a desk. And then he'd have to go out and see the world from the other side of the badge. He sat down heavily, the letter in his lap. It was a second chance, but it was a hard, painful, humbling chance. It felt less like a gift and more like a sentence to a different kind of prison. The road back, he saw now, wasn't about getting his old life back. It was about building a new one from the broken pieces, with everyone watching. And the first step was walking back through those doors he had. The first day back was the hardest. Walking into the sheriff's office, wearing his uniform, but feeling like a fraud. Dan expected stares, whispers, maybe even open hostility. What he got was worse, a polite, professional indifference. It was like he had become a piece of office furniture. The desk they put him at was in a back corner of the records room, surrounded by filing cabinets that smelled of old paper and dust. His job was data entry, transferring handwritten traffic reports into the computer system. It was mind-numbing, lonely work. Every ticket, every report, was a reminder of the job he'd lost. He did it without complaint. He paid the bill for the clothes from his diminished paychecks, each payment a small, sharp reminder. He went to the mandatory training sessions. He sat in a classroom with a use-of-force instructor who didn't mention his case, but talked about proportionality, and de-escalation until the words echoed in his dreams. He listened to a community relations liaison talk about implicit bias and building bridges. The words felt like theory, abstract and far away from the hot roadside and the sound of tearing fabric. Then the ride-alongs began. This wasn't riding with his old buddies. The sheriff had assigned him specifically to senior deputies known for their calm demeanors and deep community ties. His first was with a deputy who'd been on the force for 25 years. He was a quiet man with a face lined from the sun. He didn't ask Dan about the incident. He just drove. They responded to a call about kids playing music too loud. Instead of barking orders, the deputy got out, walked over, and talked to them about the local noise ordinance like they were adults. He knew one of their uncle's names. The music got turned down. No yelling. No tickets. Later, they were called to a tense situation at a housing complex, 2 neighbors screaming over a damaged fence. Dan watched, waiting for the deputy to take charge, to pick a side, to lay down the law. Instead, the deputy listened. He listened to one man's angry story for 10 full minutes, then listened to the others for just as long. He asked questions. He pointed out where their stories actually agreed. He didn't solve the fence problem that day, but he left them talking to each other instead of screaming. In the car, the deputy said, "Sometimes the law is just the excuse people use to be angry. Our job is to hear the real problem, even if we can't fix it." Dan just nodded, staring out the window. It was a different kind of police work. It was slower. It looked less powerful. But it left peace instead of scars. The second ride-along was with a different deputy, a woman who had grown up in the toughest part of the county. Her shift was a series of small, human interactions. She checked on an elderly woman who lived alone, just to say hello. She helped a confused man find his lost dog, getting out of the car and calling the dog's name with genuine concern. She also made a traffic stop a young guy with a busted taillight. Dan felt himself tense up, the old habits rushing back. He watched as the deputy approached, her posture relaxed. She told the driver about the light. He got defensive, his voice rising. She didn't rise to meet it. She stayed calm, explained how to get it fixed cheaply, and told him to have a better day. As they drove away, she said to Dan, almost to herself, "Everyone's having a battle you know nothing about. The badge shouldn't be another thing they have to fight." These observations chipped away at something inside. Then, he started to see the landscape of his county not as a territory to control, but as a collection of people, each with their own story. He began to understand that the authority of the badge wasn't in the fear it could inspire, but in the trust it was supposed to earn. The turning point came months in, during a required community forum. It was a meeting where citizens could speak directly to officers about their concerns. Dan was there as an observer, in plain clothes, sitting in the back. He listened as people talked about speeding on their streets, about noisy parties. Then, an older black man stood up. He didn't have a specific complaint. He had a story. He talked about the constant low-grade anxiety of being pulled over, about teaching his grandsons to keep their hands visible, to say yes sir, no sir, to move slowly. He talked about the feeling of being seen as a threat first and a person second. "You don't know what it's like," the man said, his voice thick with a tired emotion. "To feel like your own safety depends on managing another person's fear. And when that person has a gun and the law on their side, your heart just sits in your throat." Dan sat frozen in his chair. He was not thinking of the sheriff's wife anymore. He was thinking of every traffic stop he'd ever made where the driver was black. He was replaying his own tone, his own assumptions, the way he'd equated calmness with guilt. He saw his own face, reflected in that man's description, and it was an ugly sight. The hunch He'd felt that hot afternoon wasn't intuition. It was the very fear this man was describing. Only he was the one holding the gun. When the forum opened for officer response, Dan's heart hammered against his ribs. He hadn't planned to speak, but a weight was pressing on him, a debt of understanding he hadn't known he owed. He stood up. The room went quiet. A few people recognized him, their expressions turning cold. He didn't walk to the front. He just spoke from the back, his voice unsteady. "My name is Dan Strickland. I'm an officer with this department." He took a shaky breath. "I'm here tonight because I was ordered to be. But I'm speaking because I need to be. A few months ago, I did something wrong during a traffic stop. I violated a citizen's trust. I acted on my own frustration and my own prejudice. I caused humiliation and harm." He looked at the older man who had just spoken. "Sir, you said we don't know what it's like. For a long time I didn't. I didn't want to know. I thought my job was about control. I was wrong." He looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors. "I am sorry. To the person I hurt directly, I have said that. But I am also sorry to this community, because what I did broke a promise we all make to you. I'm learning now how much that promise is worth, and I won't forget it." He sat down, his face burning. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, the older man who had spoken just gave a single slow nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. It was enough. After the demotion period ended, there was another review. The sheriff called him into his office. The room no longer felt like a tribunal. It felt like an office. "Sit," the sheriff said. He looked at Dan for a long time. "The reports from your supervisors are adequate. Your training is complete. The community liaison said you spoke at the forum." "Yes, sir." "Voluntarily?" "Yes, sir." Sheriff Royce leaned back. "My wife received your final payment. And your note." Dan had included a short note with the last check, repeating his apology, no excuses attached. "She believes you meant it," the sheriff said quietly. "That matters to me." He stood up, looking out the window. "You're not getting your old rank back. That's gone. You'll start over. You'll be on probation. You'll have a field training officer watching you like a hawk for another 6 months. Every call, every stop will be reviewed. One misstep and you're done. It will be harder than your first day out of the academy. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Do you want it? After all this?" Dan didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." "I do." The sheriff turned. "Why?" Dan thought of the quiet deputy listening, of the community leader's nod, of the torn skirt that had started it all. "Because I think I can be better now. Not perfect, but better. And this community deserves better than what I was." Sheriff Royce gave another of his slow nods. "Report to patrol on Monday. Your new training officer will find you." It was his second chance. Thin as a razor's edge, Dan's first traffic stop alone. Under his new training officer's watchful eye was a nervous kid with a headlight out. Dan approached, his own heart racing. He saw the kid's white-knuckled grip on the wheel, the wide, fearful eyes in the rearview mirror. He remembered the feeling in the pit of his stomach from the forum. He took a breath. "Evening," he said, his voice deliberately calm. "I pulled you over because your left headlight is out. License and registration, please." The kid fumbled, dropping his insurance card. "I'm sorry, officer. I just got this car. I didn't know. I'm really sorry." "It's okay," Dan said. "Just get it fixed when you can. Here's your warning. Drive safe." He walked back to his cruiser. It was a small thing, a nothing stop, but he hadn't needed to prove he was in charge. He hadn't needed a hunch. He had just dealt with a problem and left a citizen feeling relieved, not scared. It was a start. He would never be the same officer who had gotten out of his car under that old oak tree. That man was gone, cut away piece by shame, by hard lessons, and by the quiet, powerful dignity of a woman in a ruined skirt. In his place was someone who understood, deep in his bones, that the real strength of the badge wasn't in the power to cut things down, but in the solemn responsibility to hold things together. The road back was long, and he was just starting down it, one careful, humble step at a time.